Well, what is the problem of conduct? What makes conduct problematical? Why, after all, can't we just solve the problem of conduct by saying, well, let's act in such a way as to maximize pleasure and minimize the pains of the moment? And if that means suffering or otherwise tolerating or putting up with others, well, we can do that. And we can do that for the sole instrumental purpose of personal gain, keeping out of trouble, and making sure that at the end of the day, things went better for us than they did for anybody else, or at least we weren't caught crying. Now, that's one solution to the problem of conduct. There are some philosophers who have recommended such a strategy, and still others who associate it with cads and highwaymen. So there's a wide range of opinion on what the standards of conduct ought to be and what principles should guide conduct. Now, one might say instead that the problem of conduct is solved by just finding a community willing to tolerate one's eccentricities, a community of kindred spirit, and that's really the end of it. If one wants to be the member of the mafia, it would be counterproductive to join a community of saints, and vice versa. But surely you should be able to find some community where killing your adversaries and trafficking in narcotics and earning a profit from prostitution and thereupon supporting cooperative political leaders is just right for some, even if unacceptable to others. As the expression goes, to each his own. After all, values do vary from place to place. No one has the last word on how I should live my life. Most people would be prepared to say today, it's difficult enough for a person to find the right life for himself or herself, let alone dictating to the balance of the human race how it ought to conduct its collective life. Now, when one starts talking about a form of life that is good or bad, virtuous or vicious, these are inevitably expressions of personal taste and preference, so the argument goes. They certainly aren't grounded in anything as firm and permanent as what the philosophers are prepared to call the truth. There might be truths of mathematics, the argument continues, but there are scarcely truths of ethics and morality. This is not the domain of objective knowledge. It's the domain of sentiment or belief, rank opinion, sometimes mere superstition. Now, what we have here is the skeptic's orientation toward what is called moral objectivity and related aspects of moral philosophy. The Socratic Platonic school must address this and attempt to make out a case for the proposition that the problem of conduct is not to be solved at the level of merely personal desire. If there is a solution to the problem of how life should be lived, it is to be found with the use of the same argumentative and analytical methods that seem to be successful in addressing the problem of knowledge. It was that approach that led to the conclusion that truth was indeed within reach and that there is no reason to assume that the same degree of certainty cannot be achieved in the moral realm, where the issue indeed is how life should be lived, what kind of life is right for beings such as ourselves. Nobody would argue, for example, that there are certain nutritional requirements that are right for beings such as ourselves, though different requirements, let's say, for bumblebees and sparrows. So it's not obviously counterintuitive to suggest that for a certain kind of being, there is a better form of life to be lived and a worse form of life to be lived. Now, this profound issue is addressed in any number of Plato's dialogues. The one I would choose for today's lecture is named after one of the central characters in the dialogue, the famous Protagoras, whom we've met before. The dialogue begins as a kind of theater piece. Many of the dialogues are theater pieces. Socrates now in the house of Callias and telling his companion how young Hippocrates had awakened him early in the morning with the news that Protagoras was in Athens. Socrates then narrates what ensued. He's telling Callias how he was awakened by this youngster. Now, the Hippocrates here is not the father of Greek medicine. More on that Hippocrates of Kos later. Hippocrates is a frequently enough occurring name in ancient Greece, not unlike Jack or Jill. So this is just young Hippocrates, who wants to get Socrates started on the day because something quite momentous is taking place, namely, Protagoras is in town. Now, Socrates is given an ironic line. He turns around and says to Hippocrates, who is so urgent about all this, "Why are you rousing me? Did he rob you?" And Hippocrates then replies rather wisely, "Yes, of the wisdom he will not share with me." Well, I should think very few things short of a fire would get Socrates out of bed more quickly than the news that a chap has arrived in town so wise as to be able to answer all our questions. I mean, this is a form of baiting if ever there was. So Socrates says, well, indeed, we better go off and get these questions answered. But first, Socrates wants to be sure that this young man knows why he should be instructed by Protagoras in the first place. So he puts several questions to him. Why, for example, would you, let's say we're talking to Hippocrates now, why would you seek to be taught by, let's say the other Hippocrates, Hippocrates of Kos? Now to this, young Hippocrates replies, why, to be a physician. Well, that makes sense. Great founder of Greek medical education. You want to be a physician? Study with him. Next, Socrates asks, what young Hippocrates would have as an aim were he to study with Pheidias or Polyclitus? Why, the answer comes back, to excel as a sculptor, of course. Pheidias, the great sculptor of the Acropolis. Now then Socrates asks him what he seeks to become in turning his life over to Protagoras. You see, it's going to make very good sense to say, if you want to be a doctor, study with Hippocrates of Kos. If you want to be a sculptor, study with Pheidias. Now, what is it you're supposed to want to be for it to make sense for you to study with Protagoras? Sensible question. Well, Hippocrates is confused now, first saying only that Protagoras would make him a sophist. Socrates has a bit of fun here, admonishing his young friend not to present himself to the Athenian people as a sophist. But the point is made. Hippocrates really has not thought deeply enough on just what he should expect to derive from the teaching for which Protagoras is so famous. Would the today's students be paced through this kind of interrogative? Why are you taking a course with so-and-so? You know, the usual answer is going to be, well, I'm planning to go to law school and course 404 is required. Well, Socrates is a little more serious about the education of Athenian youth than that. Well, after a time, the two go off to the house of Callias, entering the place where Protagoras is surrounded by the best and the brightest. And after suitable introductions, Socrates stating that the youth Hippocrates requires Socrates himself to serve as a kind of proxy, the dialogue begins. Socrates again raises the sorts of questions he presented to Hippocrates, just what is supposed to happen to Hippocrates? What is he supposed to become? How is he to be changed, just in case he's fortunate enough to become a pupil of Protagoras's? Now, at this point, ever gracious and ever eloquent, Protagoras discourses at length on certain myths about how humanity received justice and wisdom, etc. He speaks of the central role of political virtue in the life of the person and of the state, making clear that it is this that his teaching inculcates. Socrates, so enthralled, he says, this is a comic piece in parts, Socrates, so enthralled by the eloquence of Protagoras, continues to hear his voice even after he has concluded his speech. Socrates says the echo is still going on, but then he gathers himself. And for the moment, and on the authority of Protagoras, he will accept that virtue can be taught, but first it will be necessary to establish just what it is. That is, I'll grant you it can be taught if you'll tell me what it is. And once there is clarity on what virtue is, the question of if and how it is to be taught can be revisited. Well, can virtue be taught, and what is it? Now, it's useful to recall that this dialogue features a still young Socrates in his 30s, facing one of the sages of the ancient world. Plato gives Socrates lines that make it clear early on that Socrates is just getting his philosophical sea legs. He knows he's dealing with one of the most formidable intelligences in the ancient Greek world. And he wants to make sure that he, Socrates, is not going to get caught up in those very well-known sophistical devices that have you walking home wondering what hit you. So he gets Protagoras to commit himself to Socrates' own method, that dialectical method. I will ask the questions, and your replies will be to the questions. Let's not engage in these mythical digressions and metaphors. Let's stay on target. Protagoras here is really quite obliging. But when he begins to lapse into his own preferred mode of teaching, Socrates pulls him up short and says, look, I said what the ground rules were going to be, and you agreed, and if you don't abide by them, I'm leaving. So you get an almost petulant and I think rather nervous and defensive Socrates in this dialogue. This is a much analyzed dialogue, and I surely don't think anyone would declare Socrates the clear winner by the time it ends. Though in the later dialogues, Socrates revisits the same issues and I think turns in a more consistent and confident performance. But that's the atmosphere of this dialogue, a young Socrates nervously taking on Protagoras. So what are these questions going to be? Well, we can begin this way. Let's ask this question. Suppose Hippocrates here, this young boy, that I love as if he were my own son, says Socrates repeatedly, and you know I'm very concerned about his future, etc. Suppose he wanted to excel in medicine. Now, with whom would you suggest he study? These are the questions that Hippocrates had to consider before the two left for the meeting with Protagoras in the first place, and they proved to be illuminating questions when addressed to Protagoras himself. Now, we all know why one would study with great physicians, sculptors, painters, musicians. Why would one study with a sophist philosopher, and with Protagoras specifically? That is, what science or art will be thus cultivated? If study has a transforming effect, what is it that is to change as a result of this education? Again, I say, wouldn't it be something if today's undergraduates approach their colleges freshman year with just this question: what is it that's going to change as a result of what I'm prepared to expose myself to here? Look, what is it this young man would want to have to excel at for it to make any sense for him to study with you, Protagoras? And Protagoras answers in a word. He would have to wish for moral excellence, for virtue, for what in the Greek is arete. And this then gives Socrates the interrogative that actually dominates the dialogue. Yes, he says, but what is virtue, and can it be taught? Now, I want to parse these interrogatives lest they become little more than topics for a sort of cafe metaphysics. You know, ah, well, can virtue be taught, he asked himself as he strolled down the street toward the setting sun. You know, the retreating lonely philosopher with resignation, can virtue be taught? That's not the burden of the question. This is a very serious question that is going to provide the context for a rigorous philosophical analysis on the nature of virtue itself and questions about what is teachable. In his account of the myth of Zeus sending down to earth the virtues of justice, holiness, and temperance, Protagoras did not make clear, for example, whether these are separate virtues or parts of virtue as a whole. It makes a difference, for if separate, it should be possible for a person to be, say, virtuously just but intemperate, or holy but unjust, etc. When queried on this point, Protagoras answers that he intends these to be understood as parts of virtue. Well, this introduces all manner of confusion. Now Socrates wants to know if these parts are like, for example, the nose, eyes, and mouth, the parts of a face, where virtue is akin to the face as a whole. But if virtue has these different parts, each of them different from the others and serving different functions, then virtue itself is not a part of any of these. And if justice is not in any way like temperance, then temperance must match up with what is not just, i.e. with injustice. You begin to see that Socrates, though he's getting his philosophical sea legs, he's getting them very quickly, and he's got a head start on these issues. There is then a long section of the dialogue devoted to a poem by Simonides, which contains the seeming truism according to which, quote, it is hard to be good. Poets are allowed that form of philosophizing. It is hard to be good. Now, one issue arising from the poem has to do with how one retains goodness once it has been achieved. Let's say, for argument's sake, that in some sense we've become good. How do we stay that way? The point is made that, as with ascending to the heights of a jagged rock, the journey is difficult, but once at the top, it's easy to stay there. But who would contend that once virtue has been attained, it's easy to remain in that state? Consider now whether this elusive condition or state or property, call it virtue or moral excellence, consider, is it teachable? Why would Socrates raise this question about the teachability of arete, this kind of excellence, this kind of virtue? And here, so many thoughts cloud the imagination as you become a participant in the dialogue, or if not a participant, a witness to it. You're standing there, and it's Athens in the 5th century BC. Sparta has won this Peloponnesian War. Socrates and his friends are coming to grips with a certain political reality that is far from reassuring. What do we know about Sparta? Well, we know this much. We know that Sparta had the laws of Lycurgus, but refused to reduce these laws to writing, whereas Athens a century earlier had a written law. Sparta does not reduce its laws to writing, because any man who learns his duty by reading about it can't be trusted. You get the picture here, don't you? And here is battle-hardened Socrates, who already appreciates that there's something about moral excellence that defies merely academic exercises or pedagogical undertakings. There seems to be something in the being himself that reflects, generates, expresses virtue, moral excellence, arete. How can something of this nature be taught? There is more to it than that. We don't find ourselves saying, Bill tends to be virtuous between 10 and 11 o'clock in the morning, and earlier and later than that he's a felon, a bank robber, a child molester. But find him at the right time and you've got a man of virtue. Nobody thinks that. We tend to think that a person is virtuous when there is a quality about the person that expresses itself in just about every context. And for that to be the case, it must be because the actions of the person are guided by a principle or a precept that is at once unified and universally applicable. It's not just that you do something at 11, you do something on Thursdays. It's rather that you make yourself into a certain kind of person, a person whose conduct is obedient to a principle. Now, this obedience here is not blind. Socrates asks Protagoras if courage is a virtue, to which the reply is affirmative. Are the courageous also confident? Yes, says Protagoras. Is this because they understand what it is that is called for and are ready to do what is needed? Yes, of course, says Protagoras. But what of those who are utterly ignorant? Would we say that in doing the same thing, they too are courageous? Surely not. Thus, courage arises not from an ignorance of what is involved, but with full knowledge of the risks. And so with all expressions of virtue. All expressions presuppose knowledge, the truth of things. Both will agree that there is nothing mightier than knowledge, and that this would remain so even for one whose aim was to choose a path leading to pleasure and away from pain. You'd still need knowledge. Now, if this is a universal principle, the need for knowledge if there is to be virtue, that is, there must be knowledge first if there is to be virtue, and if it is a guide to life in all of the theaters of life and all of the stages of life, if it's a universal in that sense, well, alas, it is not accessible to the senses. Why is that? The senses can only pick up particulars. They cannot pick up universals. So if, in fact, behind the man of virtue, and it would be called man of virtue in that culture, behind persons of virtue, there stands a universal principle, an impelling principle, applicable in all contexts, and known in some non-sensory way. This again is where, hearkening to the Meno again, do you see, This is very much like the Pythagorean theorem. It's true of all rectilinear triangles, not just that one or this one. And that is, as it is universally the case, it is not accessible to the senses because the senses pick up only what is particular, only a this and a that. Well, here's the bind. How do we teach anybody anything? Now, in most contexts, we teach people by saying, this is a sheet of paper, this is a set of spectacles, this is a lectern, this is a shoe. That is, when we take a look at how parents teach children, they teach children by providing sensible, visible, or audible examples of what it is they're trying to convey. Teaching, as it is generally engaged in, at least early in life, is teaching by showing. It's defining things ostensively. This is a wall, that is a door, that is a person, this is a tie. Now, teaching by showing, well, anything that can be taught by showing cannot be universal. You can't point to that, which is universal. You can't point to anything that is always the case. You can only point to a this and a that. Well then, can virtue be taught? How could you possibly teach it? What is it you would show? What is it you would point to say, there's virtue? Now, I want it to be understood that that's the burden of the question. The burden of the question is, if we are dealing with something, if the something is of this nature, a universal principle, universally operative, it can't be the subject of ostensive definition. It can't possibly be something you hold up or sound out. And if it can't be dealt with that way, well then, for goodness sake, how do you teach it? What do you point to? So this is a serious question about what is teachable, and it's a serious question raised by one of the greatest teachers of all time, because you can quite understand that for someone like Socrates, if you can't teach virtue, then why bother teaching anything? I mean, what else would there be? Just a kind of training, as now I'll show you how to weld, how to use the Bunsen burner, how to make nylon in the chemistry laboratory, exercises in what the Greeks would take to be arts and crafts, techne as opposed to sophia, a kind of wisdom that should guide one all the days of one's life and should prepare one's soul for an eternal life that is undertaken with the death of the body. No, virtue better be teachable, because if virtue isn't teachable, Socrates is wasting his time. Nobody is going to take poison hemlock in order to defend his career as a teacher of welding. Now you might say, well, all right, can virtue be taught is a central question, and it's made difficult by the fact that, defined in a certain way, virtue may refer to something that can't be held up or shown, but for goodness sake, you can hold up and show rectilinear triangles, you can draw them on a piece of paper and say, oh, here's a three-sided figure as best as I can do it. I've tried to make one of the angles 90 degrees, and that's what we mean by a right-angled triangle. Now I'm going to teach you something about Euclidean geometry. Ah, well, in other words, although you can't show the universal, you can show an instance of it, at least in a suggestive way. Well, the turn the dialogue takes then is this turn. Perhaps we can't teach virtue in the empirical sense of pointing to virtue, but we certainly can point to virtuous acts. We can point to persons who act in a virtuous way. We can point to the morally excellent person, the person reflecting arete. We can point to that person. Now look, here's another problem. Suppose we take a one-year-old and we sort of hold the one-year-old erect enough. There's the one-year-old wobbling around, and we take the one-year-old to Thermopylae during the Persian Wars, and what we're going to show the one-year-old is the great General Leonidas at the pass. Leonidas, knowing that he and all his men are going to perish, they're sacrificing themselves for the liberty of the Hellenic world, one of the great heroic acts in military history, one of the great acts of bravery of all time, self-sacrificing, great courage, not heedlessness now, but a principled act of courage that must end in one's own death and the death of one's brothers. Okay, so now we've got the one-year-old looking at this. The 1-year-old is not going to see anything by way of virtue at all. The 1-year-old is going to be, as it were, looking at a game of some sort, probably enjoying the shiny helmets and the whinnying horses and the noise sent up by men in conflict. Or the 1-year-old may just take a few more sips of the bottle and go to sleep. So it isn't enough to say that perhaps we can present a person of virtue or someone behaving virtuously, and that's the way you teach it. Thus Socrates argues to the conclusion that it cannot be taught as such. But just in case that, in the end, the necessary ingredient in all virtue, so much so as to be virtue itself, is wisdom, just in case the knowledge attained by philosophical reflection is the very grounding of virtue, well, this, at any rate, is teachable. But as with the 1-year-old, not all are ready for it, and many are never going to be ready at any age. The students for this instruction must have already been prepared by the right sort of nature, at the right stage in life. Then indeed you might find within such persons something that will resonate when a virtuous act presents itself. You cannot teach the Pythagorean theorem to a 1-year-old either, nor can you teach the Pythagorean theorem to an entity whose rational resources are simply not up to the task. And so you cannot present as the emblem of virtue actions that are indeed understood to be virtuous actions, but presented to a person whose soul has been so corrupted, or is so incompletely developed, so impoverished, as not to be able to resonate to or in some way enter into a kind of sympathetic relationship with the exemplum. Do you see the point here? The point is, this is a two-way street. It's not just a matter of holding up something. You've got to know who is on the witnessing side of this example. And if it's the wrong sort, no number of examples will get through to it. It would be like presenting a great musical symphony to a person who happens to be deaf. Now we have here at once the foundations of a kind of elitist position on who shall be virtuous. We're going to confront this again famously in Plato's Republic, in which Socrates refers to the convenient fiction developed first in Hesiod's writings, the convenient fiction of men of gold, men of silver, men of brass, and men of iron. So I say we already have the position being laid down now, according to which the life of virtue is not available to just anyone and everyone. It takes a certain kind of person. We also see the foundations here being laid for an essentially developmental theory. If you're ever going to be in a position where the lessons of virtue make some impact on you, it's going to be because from the earliest time in your childhood, your soul is conditioned in such a way as to be receptive to lessons of this kind. And again, in Plato's Republic, which is the subject of the next lecture, we begin to see what kind of preparation is necessary if one is ever to be accessible to instruction by the virtuous. Now, Protagoras is mentioned centrally in another dialogue called the Theaetetus, in which that famous maxim of his is considered, man the measure of all things. And this gets back to the point that I raised at the very beginning of today's lecture. Well, look, on this question of conduct, why not just say, I'll act according to my caprice, I will do things that please me, and the reason I'm going to pay any attention to you at all is because you might be in a position to undo me, etc., etc. I'll play the game in such a way as to keep you distracted or keep you at arm's length. But I say at the end of the day, it's my game that counts, and if that means you lose, so much the worse for you. After all, if man is the measure of all things, then that becomes one acceptable answer to the problem of conduct. The way we solve the problem of conduct is for everybody to solve it for himself. Now this is what in the Theaetetus Socrates says when he's asked, well, what you have to say about Protagoras' position, man the measure of all things, tell us what you have to say about that. And Benjamin Jowett's translation has Socrates replying, "I'm charmed with this doctrine, but I wonder that he did not begin his book with a declaration that a pig or a dog-faced baboon or some yet stranger monster which has sensation is the measure of all things. Then might he have shown our magnificent contempt for our opinion of him by informing us at the outset that while we were revering him like a god for his wisdom, he was no better than a tadpole." In so many words, Socrates insists that we can't have it both ways. Protagoras can't stand there as a very paragon of wisdom and still contend that everybody has a right to his view on these things and no one has any greater authority than anyone else. At the end of the day, the problem of conduct is a problem of principle. And if the principle is right, the principle is universally right. And it is not tarnished, nor is it reduced to something else by the mere showing that large numbers of persons don't embrace it. Take it from me, my opinion counts for nothing is akin to the liar's paradox, which is everything I say is false. No, each man is not the measure of all things. There is a measure of things, and it is the task of the individual to come up with the means by which to understand that measure and apply it properly. That, anyway, is the Socratic approach to the problem of knowledge.